This is Unit 3, Lesson 7, the Problem-Solving Method, Part 1. I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about how people do real math. What I'm talking about is mathematicians, people whose job it is to use mathematics, and how that's a little bit different from what you have experienced math to be so far up until this time in school. There are basically 4 steps to what mathematicians do in the process of how they're working. I'm going to talk about each of those individually. The first thing they need to do is define their questions. They need to think through the ideas and the details of whatever problem it is that they have and figure out what are the questions that we need to tackle. What are the questions we need to ask to understand to figure out what we're doing. So here's an example. Say there's a circus act and they're going to have a human cannonball be shot from a cannon. So a question they might ask is, if they're going to make the person land in a net that's 8 feet above the ground, how far away should they place that net so that the guy lands in it? So the next step is they need to translate that to mathematics. Right? They need to prepare the questions as a mathematical model, and that's just another word for an equation, right? Translate that math question into some sort of equation that is ready for computing the answer. So often you can use techniques that you already know, equations that you already know about, or you have to maybe you need to come up with completely new ways to solve the problem. So in this case, there's an equation that can be used to describe the path that he will follow. It's called a quadratic equation. This is something that we're going to do in algebra, and that actually models the path that a person would take if they were shot out of a cannon. And so the next step is to actually use your equation and compute the answers. You're going to use that equation, do all the calculations. As you're working, you can identify if there's any sort of issues with what your equation was initially and come up with new variations. So you can see here, this looks very complicated, but this is something that is done in the spring of Algebra 1. And then the last step is to actually interpret the results. Ask yourself, did the math answers actually solve the original problem, and then fix any mistakes or refine the work and figure out if there's anything else you need to do. So you can see based on this work that they figured out they'd need to place the net 100 feet away so that the human cannonball would land on it. So these 4 steps are really what mathematicians do, but you as a math student have basically been focusing on the computing of answers. That's really what we've been learning up to now, the basics of computation. But we're going to be now moving into the realm of what's really what mathematicians do. And so we're going to be expanding our experience to include more than just computation. So we've got a method here that's going to help us step up into that realm and make our transition much more doable. These are 5 steps of the problem-solving method that we're going to be using whenever we have a word problem. And I'm going to talk through them step by step, and then we're going to get into them during class. So what if we had a problem that was this? Your extended family's renting bikes while on vacation together in Idaho. Bike rental costs a flat fee of $18.50 plus $8.50 per bike. Your cousin and his friends rented bikes yesterday and their bill was $95. So what we want to know is, how many bikes did they rent? So the very first step is to write a verbal equation. This is just an equation using words, none of the math, just what's going on in this situation. And this is what a verbal equation is going to look like. It's got various pieces that are using words to describe the parts of the problem and how they connect with one another. And this is where some students struggle at first to make these, but really if they stop trying to think of it as a math problem and just think, hey, what's going on in this situation? Most every student has a very clear intuitive sense of how all these parts relate. So that's the part of it that you need to really focus on. And then your equation piece will flow very easily from that. The second step is to assign labels. So what we're going to be doing is going to each of those pieces of the verbal equation and look back into the problem and see if you can match up what we know with each of those pieces. And so we make a label for each piece of that verbal equation. And you can see one of those important labels is the piece that we don't know. We don't know the number of bikes, and so that's going to be represented by our variable. So we're going to define our variable that way as standing for the number of bikes. After that, we're going to write an algebra equation. And this is super easy if you know how to read, because all you're going to do is match up each of the labels with each of the pieces of the equation and write them down. And now we've got an algebra equation. Look at that beautiful equation right there. The next step is to actually solve it, and we're going to learn how to do that, so you don't need to worry about that quite yet. And then the very last step is to answer in a sentence, because we want to interpret our results, and so our answer would be that they rented 9 bikes. So we're going to walk through all of these together next in class, but I just wanted to introduce to you the procedure that we're going to be using so that you'll have a sense ahead of time of all of our steps. So that's it. Go ahead and put your note sheet in your binder, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.